Yes.
Porter Halyburton, interview, take 5.
Thank you. So Porter, if you could, would you please read from this poem that your mother gave you?
Though all seems chaos now, and night prevails upon earth's wreck-strewn shores and blighted plains, yet always after winter's cruel gales comes April with her iridescent rains. These things shall pass, the wounding things of time, and comfort to sustain is found in prayer. Mankind is blessed by lives pure and sublime, the far reflection of the love we bear.
What do these words mean to you, sir?
Well, I confess that I don't remember this specifically, but I know that phrase, these things will pass, these things too will pass. And that I think has been something that stuck with me for a very long time. That oftentimes things seem so bleak, but my mother used to always say, these things will pass, you just got to deal with it and wait, and they will pass, even the worst. And that's true. That's always been the case.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And could you read High Flight, please? Or if you could quote it from memory?
I can't do that anymore, but I could at one time. Yeah, high flight, particularly among aviators, was such a inspirational kind of thing that explained a lot of things. So yeah, it was important. High flight. Oh, I've slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the humbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through the footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
And finally, there's a poem there from Invictus.
A part of it, yes.
Yes, sir.
Invictus by William Ernst Henley. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
You're placing down there.
Yeah.
Those last words, they seem to encapsulate your experience in Vietnam. That no matter how straight the gate.
Yeah, the master of my soul is stretching it a bit. I think that you do have a great deal of control over what happens to you through the choices you make. I think our lives are determined more by our reaction to what happens than what happens. And so maybe it's 80-20, maybe it's 90-10, whatever it is. But I think the majority of our lives are determined by the choices we make. And so in that sense, I resonate with that idea, I'm the captain of my soul, but as a religious person, I'm not entirely sure that I'm the captain. I might be, the navigator, something like that, but not the captain. And but certainly I am not just flowing along, with the tide.
Yes. Yeah. Well, one could say God's the ship. So
Yes.
You got to steer it.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
you tell the story of when you went back to visit Vietnam. There was a particular episode that demonstrated among one of your fellow POWs the incredible self-sacrifice that you would all do for each other. Can you tell me the story about the hole in the ceiling?
Ah, yes. Well, as I said, one of the real heroes there, and one of the great leaders, who was not a senior person at all, was a guy named Bob Purcell. He was a Air Force captain, and I had heard stories about Percy before I ever met him and lived with him, and I had the privilege of living with him for a good while, and saw him in action in so many different ways. And if you talk to any POW, you know, everybody knows about Percy, and everybody loves him, and you know, they're sorry that he's gone now, because he was such an inspiration. And yet he was a flawed human being, you know, like all of us. And he, you know, but the story that I remember the most was told to me before I ever knew it. And then I talked to him about it later. And he was in a prison. We were in the zoo, the zoo, and in the cell block we call the pool house, which was 10 cells that were made out of 3 rooms. And so when they divided this up and made it into prison cells, they had gone up in the ceiling in the overhead and run electrical lines up there and dropped a cord down in every room so they could burn a 25-watt bulb in there and look in the peephole at night and see what you were doing. And so in order to get up in the overhead, they had cut a hole in the ceiling and used a ladder to get up there and all of that. And Bob and Percy was put in cell number 1, which was that cell with the hole in the ceiling. But they hadn't covered that back up because there was no way you could get up there without a ladder or something to stand on. And we had nothing, no furniture, nothing. And so it was there. And down at the other end of the cell block, cell number 5, they put a guy named Norland Daughtry. And Norland was also an Air Force captain, and he was really badly injured. His arms were both broken, one in 2 places, the other in 3. And he was refusing to talk to the Vietnamese as well, and yet that was inspirational in itself. And they wouldn't give him any medical care, didn't give him even a sling to put his arms in or anything. And so he's down there, and they are withholding food and water. So Percy hears about this through our comm network, and supposedly he tapped on the wall to the senior guy there and said, you know, I got some excess food here, and I wonder if it's okay if I try to take some down to Norland. And of course the guy said, well, yeah, I don't know how you're going to do that, but yeah. And somehow Percy figured out how to get up into that hole. He gets up there. He also had tied a string to his water jug, and he pulled the water jug up with him, and he crawls down the ceiling. And the minute he's out of his cell into this overhead, he has made an escape attempt. And as we know, they kill people for that. And so he was really taking his life in his hands, certainly his health in his hands, when he decided to get out of that cell in that way. So he crawls down there, and supposedly he gets above Norland's cell, and he's looking down through this hole in the ceiling, and he sees poor Norland down there with his broken arms. And he said, hey, Norland. Well, Norland, you know, he'd been praying a lot. He thought God was talking to him, answering his prayers. Percy said, no, it's me up here, Percy. And so he told him a couple of jokes, you know, and tried to cheer him up. And then he had taken his food, and the solid food, the rice and whatever solids were in the soup, and he made little balls out of it, and he stuffed those balls down for Norland. he brought his water jug up there and he poured water down for Norland. And he did this every day for 2 weeks. And there were other guys who were being starved as well. And he fed them as well. And the Vietnamese must have thought, these Americans are really pretty amazing. They can survive on no food or water for all this time. Now, and Percy did this for 2 weeks and lived essentially on the broth from the soup, so-called soup, and risked his life every day to do that. And so there were 3 consequences of that, as I see it. Number one, he kept these guys alive, Norland particularly. Number 2, he demonstrated to the Vietnamese that this technique of theirs was not working. And to my knowledge, they did not use starvation as a method of coercion. They certainly used it as punishment, but not coercion to do something specifically. And number 3, and most importantly, this story went viral pretty slowly, but it spread. Everybody heard about this. And it was so inspirational that here it seemed like an impossible task, and yet Percy did it. And he did it because he was courageous, because he was willing to sacrifice himself for others, and he didn't ever want to claim any credit for it or anything like that. So this act of leadership, even though he may not have thought of that as an act of leadership, it was, because it raised the bar, for what you can do to help somebody else. And I think it really inspired people to do more than they ever thought that they could.
It's so extraordinary that I was thinking as you were telling this story, this is the essence of leadership. There is the leadership that Cag Stockdale and Denton and others would show, but then there's the leadership that happens in followership. Those in the ranks who demonstrate something and something stands out.
Yep.
Can you put that into a statement to young leaders, young midshipmen at the Naval Academy, for instance, or young cadets at West Point, who are asking the question, how can I be a leader tomorrow? And maybe in their mind it's whether they're an admiral or a general, but what you're saying is something very different.
Well, I think that, you're thinking about leadership, and I have sort of thought about leadership in terms of the leaders that I saw in Vietnam and the leaders that I saw at the Naval War College. We always had a president who was 2 stars or 3 stars. Admiral Stockdale was 3 stars. But they all had the same job and the same responsibilities, and they all approached it in different ways. And they had different styles of leadership and so on. And so I think, even though I was never a senior leader at all, I became an observer of leadership and using these 2 sort of laboratories. And to me, there are a few essential things that I draw from that. And one of them is that what you say is important, and you need to be able to communicate your ideas that are important to your troops in a clear and cogent way. Because you need to think about what you say to the people that you are leading, and to convey that clearly. The second thing about that is that your actions have to support your words. And so leadership by example in many ways is more important than what you say. If you can demonstrate what you stand for, what you are willing to do, to the extent that you will go to stand up for your troops or do what's right, or sacrifice your own perhaps career in order to do what's right. Those are the important things. Those are the things that will make an impression on others. And so always, I say that's the most important part of leadership, is if your words are in consonance with your actions. And if they're not, you'll fail, I think, as an inspirational leader. So to me, that's the essence of leadership.
And you make the point with Percy and Doug Hagel, for instance, that these, perhaps it can be said that at times officers in training make the mistake of thinking of leadership as something that happens in the elite, in the officer corps, or whatever it is. And yet what you find is that single individuals can stand up in a way, I mean, to date, my understanding is the one person who will receive a standing ovation if he comes to the reunions is Doug Hagel.
That's right.
And why is that?
Well, I think because he demonstrated by his actions, not just what he said, but what he did, this incredible dedication to doing something important and something that was going to really make a difference. And the fact that he was just this seaman, was beside the point, really, And I tell people I talk to about leadership and ethics and so on, that really doesn't matter how high up the chain you are. You're always a leader, and you're always a follower. There's always somebody senior to you, and there's always somebody junior. And so you got to think of yourself that way, that you're not just, an important leader. You're a follower too. And you're not just a follower. You are a leader to those who are junior to you in whatever way. But they are observing you, they're listening to what you say, they're watching what you do. And so the fact that you're wearing these two leadership hats, at the same time is very important. Some people lose sight of it and think that they're just the leader, not a follower. So
one of the things that the Doug Hagel story perhaps represents for future leaders is and I think it's encapsulated in what you said, where you stopped making a judgment. Some of the people that you thought might have been the best leaders turned out not to be, and some of the people you would have discounted turned to rise out. So there was this way in which you suspended judgment, and that you see human beings as resources that they perhaps can step up and show or not. And so if there's a way in which you can pull this together as an object lessons for young leaders of tomorrow, like to value the potential around them.
Yeah.
Did you know what I'm saying?
I do. I think. I know that for me personally, I struggle with judgment, being judgmental of other people, usually for superficial reasons. But I have certainly learned. This is a lesson that I have learned myself and know and understand and still struggle with because it's difficult. And yet I know that if you judge somebody initially on personal appearance or any other attribute, whether their skin color or whatever, their sex or whatever, your initial judgment is probably going to be wrong. And that you discover that people underneath all personal appearance or anything, are human beings of great value, and that they can do things that you would never imagine. And Doug Hagel is certainly the prime example of that, in that he was just this young 19-year-old seaman, who happened to fall off a ship out there and happened to wind up in our prison. And because of who he was, the Vietnamese offered him early release. who wouldn't jump at that? I mean, he was not technically a POW. He was a survivor at sea. And yet he turned them down. He said, no, I'm going home when everybody else goes. And it took another senior officer, Dick Stratton, to teach him all this important information, names of people who were there, all about torture, all about communications, all about prison life, and then order him to accept early release. And Doug reluctantly did that. But he did, in so doing, he made a dramatic change in so many things. 15 minutes after he landed, after being returned to the United States, he was on the telephone with my wife, telling her that I was alive and I was okay. And I'm sure he did that with two other guys who had been killed in action. And then he was sent on a trip around to visit every SEER school: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. And he taught them the TAP code. He taught them methods of second line of resistance that we talked about. He taught them what was going on in the prisons and all of this, and completely revamped all the SEER school training. And so guys who were shot down after that came in much, much better prepared than those of us who were shot down early. And they knew the TAP code, they knew, who's who, all that, if they paid attention in SEER school. And it was all because of this 19-year-old kid who just happened to have an incredible memory and an incredible willingness to do this. So, who would have thought the most junior guy there would have some of the biggest impact on things of anybody?
And we've sort of passed over the story of you. The last we left you, you parachuted down from that escarpment, but Al Carpenter was flying overhead, and that's not what he saw.
Hold on before Porter answers. We're getting a oil report from Kent.
Over the left brow as well. Thank you.
Don't touch him. Only I'm allowed to touch him.
Just pointing.
Are you guys texting this information?
No, he was flagging me.
I was tapping to her.
He was very overt.
9 more days, Kurt.
What?
9 more days.
9 more minutes?
9 more days.
9 more days, right.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I did not know that I had been declared killed in action. I knew my radios didn't appear to work, but in the Hanoi March, I looked at all the cameras and made very much of an attempt to make myself visible and known. But I didn't know I'd been declared killed. So I think it was in February of 1967, I was looking through the crack in my door. I was living with a guy named Dick Ratzlaff, and Dick was he was allowed to write letters. I was not, and most of us were not, but he was for some reason. Anyway, I'm looking through the crack, and I could see, the next building, and I could see people going back and forth to interrogation and doing different things. And I see this guy walk by there, and I recognized him as someone that had been on our ship. But I knew everybody that had been shot down on our cruise, and he wasn't one of them. And it took me a little while to realize that his name was Al Carpenter, and he was a LSO, landing safety officer aboard the ship. And that's how I knew him, because, they debriefed the pilots and so on about their landings and everything. And he was an A4 pilot, I knew that. And so I knew that he lived in this cell block over here, and so I sent a message across here, and then that message went over from cell block to cell block, which is, difficult, takes time. and said, "Oh, I'm here, I'm glad to see you, whatever." And days went by, and then I finally got a reply from Al, and it said, "Well, I'm glad to see that you're here and you're alive because you're supposed to be dead." Well, talk about a shock, He said, "You were declared KIA." And as I later learned, it was largely on his testimony of not seeing any shoots, not seeing anybody jump out of the airplane, not hearing any radio broadcasts or anything. And nobody else did either, but he was closest to us. He was the one that really had caused us to be declared KIA. So I know that Al, he felt badly about that. But I didn't. I knew it was a failure of our equipment rather than failure of his at all. And so I never, of course, never blamed him at all. But I kid him about it every now and then. So.
And this had a consequence, a great consequence back home for you and for your wife, did it not?
It was, because she found out that I was alive about the same time I found out I was dead. And of course, she had been a year and a half, and so she had gone on with her life and trying to, raise our daughter and so on. I think she'd been dating a guy, and I think as soon as she heard I might be alive, she called him up and said, it's all over. He might, and this guy supposedly said, "Well, I've been dumped for a number of reasons, but this is the most unique one yet." So as soon as Marty thought that I might be alive, then she jumped into action with trying to do what she could, to help with the effort to improve our conditions and get information and all of that. So she became very involved with Sybil Stockdale and the National League of Families in their awareness campaign, including, selling bracelets with our names on them and everything. And this is one that has my name on it, but they almost everyone. Fred Cherry did not have a bracelet made because Shirley, his wife, maintained that he was dead to his children and to everybody else. She knew he wasn't, but so he never had one of these bracelets. But they were started by an outfit called Viva Voices in Vital America, and they were sold by a number of different ways, but certainly through the National League. My wife sold thousands of these with my name on them, and I'm sure there were thousands, with everybody else's names. But they were just a reminder to people, here's a guy who is not with us anymore, and you need to pray for them and think about them and write a letter, and to the government, to North Vietnam, whatever, in support of them. And then so when we found out about this, this was such an incredible thing that people would be willing to wear these things and do this in support of us. And after I got back, I got hundreds, maybe thousands of these that were sent back, along with letters and so on. And so I was so touched that people did that, that I answered all those letters, and I told them how much I appreciated their concern and everything. And even to just weeks ago, I continue to get a bracelet from somebody. Some girl says, my mother died and I was cleaning out her stuff in her jewelry box and I found this bracelet. And I remember she wore this bracelet, during the war. And I looked you up and I found out your address and I'd like to send this to you. So I mean, it's still an incredible thing, and I actually wear one myself. It's a copper one, and I wear it for therapeutic reasons. But I've reversed it so that the writing on it is underneath, so I don't have to constantly explain to other people why I wear it. But I wear it to remind myself of the incredible things that people have done for us, and to do things to try and improve our condition and to get us home. And I think that was a big factor in that too. All three of my children, for some reason, wear one of these too. So.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So, I mean, through the bracelets, well, first of all, let's put into perspective that in the time in which you were considered KIA, you were actually buried in honor. Can you speak about that?
Well, of course, I didn't know any of this until Al Carpenter informs me I was dead. And you can imagine the thoughts that go through your mind in a kind of situation like that your wife has remarried, and that complicates things a lot. And the difficulty that it might pose in your return. But fortunately for me, that was not a concern, because Marty had not remarried and was not serious about anybody else, and worked so hard in our behalf. She also made sure that our daughter Dabney grew up knowing about me, about her father, and keeping my sort of image alive and so on. And so to know that Marty and the other wives worked so diligently, along with help from people like Ross Perot and many others, who really worked so hard to they were not demanding our release. They were just demanding that we be treated decently, as we should under the Geneva Conventions, which certainly we were not. They violated every provision of the Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners. And so, I owe such a tremendous debt of gratitude to my wife and my wonderful Marty and all the other wives and families, who were so loyal and so hardworking in our behalf. And sadly, many guys came home to unhappy situations. And so I feel doubly grateful, that I came home to a wonderful situation. Even though my mother and my beloved grandparents had died while I was gone, I came home to a wonderful, loving family, and still married today after, over 50 years of marriage. And so I wear this bracelet, in a way to remind myself of how fortunate I am. And anytime I feel kind of down or something's not going right, I can look and remind myself that it's pretty trivial compared to a lot of things, and compared to the horrors that so many millions of people in the world endure today. We just don't realize as Americans how fortunate we are. Even the poorest of us in America are better off than millions of people in the rest of the world. And we don't quite often realize that and be grateful for it.
And you keep something in your yard, do you not?
I do, and after I came back home, Davidson arranged a big celebration for my first time to come back to Davidson for a visit, and they blocked off our street and Larmer Road, which was named for my grandfather. And of course, it had been no alcohol or anything allowed in the city limits of Davidson. And in my honor, they had a keg of beer. And practically everybody in town showed up, black and white and rich and poor. And everybody was there. The governor was there, and he was speaking from the front porch of the house where I grew up in. Somebody was renting it at the time. And my favorite professor at Davidson was there, and he spoke, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful time. And then this man who was a friend of the family named, he came up to me and we talked for a minute, and he said, "By the way, I have something of yours." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" He was the funeral director. He had retired and sold the business and everything. But he said, "I have your tombstone." I said, "You have what?" "Your tombstone." "What would you like me to do with it?" I said, "I haven't given that a lot of thought, but I'll think of something." And so it turned out he had, when my mother died, they knew that I was alive, so they took my tombstone out and put hers in. And he had kept this in his garage all this time. So I had the Navy pick it up along with my other effects and everything, and we took it. We were living in Atlanta, so we took it to Atlanta. And it was set up in the woods for a while, and then we brought it down and put it by this garden area. And then we left Atlanta and went to Rhode Island, and we lugged that thing up to Rhode Island, and I eventually built a big grape arbor in front of our garden and everything, and their stone was right there, and it was a great conversation piece. And then we left Rhode Island and we drug it back to North Carolina, and now it sits right outside the garage here in Greensboro. So it's a great conversation piece, and I like to say that it's great to go out there and look down at it instead of up.
Oh, that's good, Porter. Wow. Okay, so let me check my notes here.
I'm gonna do a little sensor.
And what was the timing again?
3:30.
3:30? Okay, great. You okay, Porter? You want to get up and stretch for a second?
No, I'm okay.
Oh, there was a sound in the prison system that everyone talks about.
The gong?
Well, that one too, but it was the jingling of.
Keys.
Talk about the jingling of keys.
Well, it came to be that you expected the jingling of the keys when the turnkey is coming around during the day doing the normal routine, which would be, I don't know why, I think because Ho Chi Minh smoked and he had been in prison, that we were allowed to smoke. And so we got 3 cigarettes a day. And so the guard would come around three times during the day, usually sticking them through the peephole, the flap, not unlocking the door. But we got 2 meals a day, and you went outside to pick them up and bring them in. So the jingling of the keys, you heard them coming in anticipation. They're bringing the meal, or here he comes with the cigarettes, or, there's all this anticipation of the very few activities during the day. So you were used to keys jangling in that sense. But if the keys jangled late at night, you knew something bad was happening. You were going to move, you were going to interrogation, something bad was going to happen. Hardly anything good happened when the keys, when they opened the door late at night. And usually a move was done late at night. And so I think that came to be the most terrifying sort of sound, that late at night, if you were awakened by the keys jangling outside your door, you know, that was terrifying kind of sound. And I know that was, you know, this story about Mike Christian, when they came to get him, it was late at night. And we could hear the keys jangling out there. And all of us knew what was going to happen. And it was a terrifying kind of thing. So, yeah, that's not a good sound. Still, if I am awakened tonight by the jangling of keys, it will have, I think, that same effect.
So I wonder, yeah, I was gonna ask that very question. Oh, yeah. There were many inventive ways that you passed time. And, you know, one of the things that perhaps people who are entertained by iPhones and
Right.
internet of today perhaps lack an understanding of is the power of their own imagination.
Sure.
You speak about educating each other, you speak about, but when you were living a life through the walls, tapping through the walls, you actually created in incredibly inventive ways. You speak of sailing trips you took, of meals you took. Can you talk about some of those? Tell the story of the sailing trips.
Well, I lived with a guy named Fred Purrington, and I lived with him on several different occasions. But if you put all those times together, I lived with him longer than any other one guy. So I got to know Fred pretty well. And so he was a big sailor, and he was from Padenham in Massachusetts, and they happened to build Concordia yachts there. And so he had grown up sailing all in the waters of Massachusetts and Rhode Island and so on. And so I had never done much sailing at all and didn't know anything about the Northeast and so on. And so I'm telling him things about the South, and we are going on trips and so on. And so we started planning these trips on the boat that he hoped to own one day, which was a Concordia 40-foot yawl. And so we named this ship the Good Life, because one of the songs that we had heard over the loudspeakers being played one day was Nancy Wilson singing The Good Life. And that seemed to be so appropriate. So we named his ship to be The Good Life. And so we would, he would plan these trips. We'd go out to Block Island, and we'd go to all these ports and so on, and he would describe each one and say what was there, and you know, the condition of the water and how you tack and how you do this and you do that and all this stuff. Well, my job was entertainment. And so I had to provide, most importantly, the female companionship and the food, the music, the whole ambiance and everything. So when we got into port, you know, and dropped anchor or tied up, then I had to, all of this kind of stuff. So anyway, I had to be pretty inventive about all of this. And so I was telling Fred, I was setting this romantic scene, you know. I had a date for him, this gorgeous brunette woman with long hair, and her name was Dagny Taggart, a character from one of Ayn Rand's novels. And I'm describing, Fred is lying on the deck of the ship, and Dagny is there lying beside him, and you know, her hair is spilling over his chest, and I'm describing this, and he said, I said something about the hair on his chest, and he, where in the hell did I get that? Because he didn't have any hair on his chest. I said, Fred, you blew the whole mood here. So Anyway, we had a good laugh. I still every now and then have a good laugh about that. You know, where'd I get the hair on my chest? I said, not yours, hers. So we took lots of these trips and so on. Yeah.
And all of this, make the point that all of this is communicated through taps, right? These.
No, I was living with Fred.
Oh, you were living with him?
Yeah, I was living with Fred. Yeah, we did a lot of things through tapping. You know, the Howie Dunn story, and well, I lived beside Jerry Denton, and we actually played chess through the wall. And we took we got toilet paper in a sheet like that, so you tore it up into smaller pieces you could possibly get by with. And so we took a sheet of each of us took a sheet of paper, through, you know, he's in a different cell, and you folded it up until you had the proper number of squares, you know, 8 across this way and that way, and used cigarette ash to blacken the black squares. Then we took, we were getting bread at the time, and so every meal you'd save just a little bit and make a couple of pieces, you know, players. So soon we had enough, we had the 16 pieces needed, and or 32 actually. And so we'd set the board up, and you know, white would make the first move, and you tap. There's a convention for moving pieces, you know, pawn to queen's pawn 6 or whatever it was. So we used that, and we actually played a game of chess, because the difficulty was that you couldn't get through a whole game before the guards were coming to do something, and you had to cover this all up and hide it and so on. You had to memorize the board, though, and recreate it when you got back to the game. So it was a laborious process, but it was well worth it, because it was a sense of achievement, you know, that you're doing something you're not supposed to do, and you're entertaining yourself, and you're not allowed to have any entertainment and that kind of thing. And we did a lot of that kind of thing. We actually, one time in this group of 9 of us, we decided to make a deck of cards. We weren't allowed to have any kind of games or anything. So we took the same kind of crude paper that was used for, it was like a brown paper towel with sticks and stuff and sand, and you know, it was pretty crummy. But we used the best part. Finally got 52 little sheets like that, and used brick dust and cigarette ashes to mark them. So we had this deck of cards, and a lot of people wanted to play bridge. I was the only person that could play bridge, and my mother was a great bridge player. She had taught me. I'd played a lot in college and so on, and I knew all the conventions, all this stuff. And so I said, well, sure, you know, one guy didn't want to play, which was fine. That gives 8 people that wanted to play. So we could actually play, you know, contract bridge. So anyway, we played bridge with them, and people learned all this stuff. Well, we had a hiding place for them, for the cards. And one day, the guard got the door open before we actually got them hidden. And he saw them. And of course, he calls everybody, and they come and they take the cards and they rip them up. They, you know, set them on fire. They throw them in the bucket, and they put us all in leg irons and handcuffs and chew us out and slap some people around and so on. And then on the way out, I know the interrogator said, "You are forbidden to play cards." Well, they just destroyed our cards. How are we going to play cards? So they leave, and here we are sitting around in leg irons, and somebody said, "Let's play without the cards." So we did. It only worked because we had 9 people. So the ninth guy who didn't want to play in the first place becomes the dealer. And his job was to mentally take these 52 cards, divide them up into 4 piles of 13, and to memorize each pile. Then to 4 other guys, he teaches the 13 cards. Each pile to one guy. They become the hand, and the remaining 4 people become the players. So they consult with their hand in bidding and in playing. And everybody has to memorize everything. So the dealer then, this ninth guy, also becomes sort of the referee. You know, if somebody plays a card that they don't really have, then they get called on it. So we actually played some bridge with these cards, memory bridge. And it served 2 purposes. One is that, you know, they told us we couldn't do it, and did it anyway. We played cards anyway. And number 2, it was such a great sense of accomplishment, you know. Who would have thought you could do that? But because of having 9 people, we could, and so we did it. So it was a great sense of accomplishment to do that.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful story. There's another story, is there not? Were you present when Phil Butler said that you can never overestimate the power of humor in a situation like
Right.
this. Like, you could never lose your sense of humor.
Right.
And the humor meant so much to all of you. And do you remember the story of Bomb the Cabbage Patch?
Say that again, Bob.
Bomb the Cabbage Patch? Well, in brief, it was, you were always given Cabbage Patch soup, and you were always cabbage soup, and you were just tired of it.
Oh.
And then there was bombing raid, and someone yells out in the distance, "Bomb the cabbage!" And everybody.
No, I never heard that one.
Al Carpenter tells a story of one night, you know, things were pretty glum in general, and then someone started singing "God Bless America." Were you there?
Yeah. That was in the, I think that was in the big camp. We were all together, you know, and feeling our oats and so on. And so I think that's when we started doing things aloud like that, saying "God Bless America" and all of that. And because we were feeling strength in numbers, because, you know, we were 40 or so of us in a cell, and we were all pretty much in the same boat. So, yeah.
And the way Al tells it is that the Vietnamese soldiers got really upset and threatened each of you with being shot, and you sang all the louder.
Right. Yeah, and that's why it was, you know, the strength in numbers. You know, we knew they weren't going to shoot us all, and they did come around and threaten. Anytime you did anything like that, you know, sing out loud, which we did, and they'd come around and, you know, come in and threaten to shoot you or whatever. And we felt we were in a pretty good position. But the Vietnamese did make it pretty clear that if there was an escape attempt or an attempt to rescue us, like Sante, that we were going to die, because they started carrying hand grenades, and they were going to heave them through the windows. And so we actually had plans to barricade. We had these very heavy teak wood bedboards, and so we had plans to make shelters out of them if they were going to do that. So, no, but humor, I think, was very important. I told that story about Mike Christian. That little bit of humor there changed everything. And I usually tell that story not only about making choices, but about humor, because he made a choice to use that humor to lighten up this very dismal kind of situation. And I had a friend, excuse me, I lived with a guy from from Louisiana. And he was a coon ass, and that's what we called him, the coon ass, Glenn Daigle. And he had a wry sense of humor, and every now and then things would really get bad, and he would say, just remember, it's always darkest right before it's totally black. Just to remind us, hey, wait a minute, it could get worse here. So, no, a lot of the humor, I think that we can't really repeat, because prison humor is kind of grim and,
Would you mind, sir? Do you know the words to God Bless America?
I think so.
Would you mind singing it for us?
I'm not sure I can sing with this voice here, but I'll try.
Thank you.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night and the light from above. From the mountains and the prairies to the ocean white with foam, God bless America, our home sweet. That's as good as I can do.
Now, is this perfect? This could be done. You have a rich life. You're an artist. We were all saying, you're really an extraordinary potter. You just came back from a world cruise. You can do what you want. Freedom must have a special meaning to you. What is freedom, sir, to you?
Well, freedom, I think, is not just being able to do whatever you want to do. It is freedom to do what is important and what's meaningful, and to assume the responsibility for that freedom, which I think is a component of freedom. Freedom doesn't mean anything unless you assume the responsibility for the things that you do because of that freedom. And of course, a lot of people abuse that freedom and do not assume responsibility for it. It goes along with a choice. You can choose, but you're responsible for your choices. So I think it's the marriage of freedom and responsibility that is really leads to a more fulfilling life and experience. Yeah, and I feel so very blessed in every way because of the people that I know, the people that have influenced my life, the opportunities that I've been given. My time at the Naval War College was more than I could ever have asked for, because it was an opportunity to influence so many other people, hundreds, thousands of people, future leaders come through there, and you have an opportunity to perhaps teach them something, perhaps influence them in some way. I still go back to the War College every year and have the opportunity to tell my story and my lessons, to the student body there. And every time I have any number of them come up and say, what you said is really meaningful. It changed my way of thinking about things. And I hear that all the time. And that's the reason that I am willing to speak in public, because it does seem to make a difference in some people's lives. I had a woman say, you just saved my marriage. And another guy, was dying of MS and had given up all hope and everything. And he said, what you said about making choices and forgiving and everything changed my life. And so that was, it's pretty important, heavy stuff. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to be able to influence people's lives in a way that makes a difference.
You wanna bring that up, Ken?
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, give me a second.
Sorry for the delay.
All right. Can't the people here explain what's going on?
It said it was a motion sensor issue, that the
Mm.
motion sensor's gotta be activated for it to stay
They do
on.
events, so it's actually not an issue.
Hmm?
If they do events normally, so it's not an issue because somebody's always in movement.
I'm gonna go ahead and cut Ken for a
Okay.
second, might as well let,
But
I'll
we
Porter.
didn't find out about it until it happened the first time. She didn't know that it would happen.
Let's let Porter stretch his legs for a moment. How about another 15, 20 minutes?
I might need her,